Okay, I can't wait to start filming the footage I need for the switch axe. Should be easy peasy, no issues whatsoever, super simple.
A few moments later.
A-part tip redact.
What?
A-part tip redact. Scavern.
What are you talking?
Raverdent Scavern. Kashmirga.
So when it comes to Monster Hunter, I feel like a lot of you know my style and preferences by now. Mainly that I've been sticking to one weapon throughout the entirety of the series with little to no wiggle room. But when choosing the weapon I'd use throughout the entirety of the series, it's not like Longsword was the only weapon I thought about. No, in fact, Tri introduced one weapon that was so unique, so different in comparison to everything else available, that I had to see if it was right for me. Spoiler alert, it wasn't, but it did leave a lasting impression. I'm talking, of course, about the switch axe, potentially one of the first weapons to really diversify and accentuate the design of weapons in Monster Hunter as a series. A weapon with the ability to not only act as a heavy-hitting axe, but transform into a giant sword exploding with energy. It just had this flamboyant flair about it, something so eccentric that was incredibly new to the series at the time. It's no wonder that I was drawn to it at this point, and we're going to take today to look at all of its features and developments from Monster Hunter Tri all the way to Rise. In my previous videos, I may have listed each individual attack and their button combinations. In reality, I feel like this is a bit convoluted and confusing for a history video, so I'll be focusing on some major attacks and features rather than each, slash, lunge, or basic combo. Also, as I mentioned in the previous videos, I take a look at the comments and see what you guys want me to cover next. I saw a lot of requests for every weapon, and so I tried running a poll to see what the next video should be. Surprisingly, Switch Axe won by a large margin, so here we are. Don't worry, your weapon will be covered eventually, so be sure to subscribe so that you can catch the video once released. In the meantime, I'm Super Rad, and this is the history of the Switch Axe. The switch axe would be introduced in Monster Hunter with the release of Tri on August 1st, 2009. It was truly unique in both visual design and the mechanics it introduced to the series. As I mentioned previously, the weapon exists within two forms. To start, we'll take a look at the axe form, which is a heavy-hitting and long-reaching weapon perfect for attacking flying enemies that hover above you. This state of the weapon is what you would generally use within a hunt, and despite its size, it's fairly mobile with decent damage output. The axe's moveset consists mostly of lunges and chops, but has the ability to perform a swinging pseudo-infinite that is limited by the player's stamina. From what I could tell during my research, the damage output of this infinite is high, but isn't worth the cost of the stamina at this point in the series. This could be dependent on what stats and elements were available to the weapon while in this mode. Additionally, items like Mega Dash Juice make the ability much more worthwhile. It's also an incredibly dangerous combo as it's difficult to stop and get out of, meaning if you start it, you'll take a large stamina loss regardless and probably get hit. Now, sword mode is the really unique part about this weapon. The hunter has the ability to switch the mode of their weapon on the fly whenever they want to weave the change of modes in through their combos. Once in sword mode, the hunter will gain access to the ability of their weapon's file, an ability that is built into the weapon and dependent on the type of switch axe you're using. There's a meter under the sharpness icon similar to that of the spirit gauge that fills over time while in axe mode, and the use of the sword is dependent on it. If the gauge runs out, the hunter will automatically switch back to axe mode and be forced to perform a reload animation that will allow the gauge to start recharging. So what makes the sword mode advantageous? It's two things that both center around the use of files. To start, each file that may be attached to the weapon has a special effect that dictates how sword mode will interact with the monster. Power file boosts the raw damage of sword mode, elemental file will boost the weapon's elemental attacks, dragon file bestows dragon element on the weapon, and a paralysis file can inflict the paralysis ailment. The second big advantage is the elemental burst or discharge effect. Players can combo into a special attack out of an elemental thrust attack that allows them to charge the energy remaining in their gauge into a high damage attack that is not only incredibly powerful, but still benefits from the effects of the file. However, this will automatically drain the gauge and revert the weapon back to axe form. The nice thing about this burst is that it doesn't seem to rely on how much of the gauge is left to determine damage, meaning it's beneficial to get the most out of your sword mode with your normal combos and then finish off near the end of the gauge with an elemental discharge. The discharge mode is a charging attack that needs to be built up by having the hunter mash the attack button, but it can be cancelled out of in dangerous situations or even fired off early at reduced damage. Finally, while in sword mode, the hunter gains an inherent mind's eye ability, meaning that the weapon will never bounce off of the monster regardless of sharpness. I should also point out that the gauge only depletes when attacking and that the hunter can draw into sword mode with the right button combination. On top of the two forms, the weapon also added an evade step mechanic. After an attack, a hunter has the ability to quickly evade to the right or left without rolling in order to keep the aggression on the monster and lower the overall recovery time while keeping situational mobility. While attacking, Switch Axe also benefits from a low amount of super armor, preventing knockback from weak attacks. A really annoying factor about the weapon in Tri specifically is that it's not even unlocked from the get-go. Instead, players have to reach a certain point in the game where the Argosy captain will teach the blacksmith how to make them. After that, the player will have full access to a very limited set of Switch Axes. Not every monster had a Switch Axe equivalent, so the options for a hunter would be few and far between. Despite its unique design and mechanic, the weapon isn't very popular. In a 10th anniversary poll, the weapon was ranked 11th out of all weapons available by fans, and even in World is usually the 10th most used weapon overall, at least on PC. Despite this, the weapon would see various changes not only throughout different generations, but the releases within those generations as well. With the release of Portable Third, the Switch Axe would receive a brand new icon. Originally, it boasted a design that looked solely like an axe, without actually conveying its ability to shift between two modes. Starting in Portable Third, the new icon was designed to show the two sides or modes of the weapon with different blades on each end. This icon design would persist throughout the remainder of the series. Not only was the weapon fully available from the get-go, but monsters that originally didn't have a Switch Axe equivalent in Tri now gained a version of their own, making the roster for the weapon much larger in comparison to its Wii counterpart. This wasn't only the case for Tri monsters, but for Monster Hunter Freedom Unite and Portable Third exclusive monsters as well, really fleshing out the weapon. Moves that were annoying to use before, like the pseudo-infinite slashing attack, were now able to be cancelled out by evading. Performing infinite combos was also much easier in this entry, with both sword and axe forms allowing the user to simply press triangle repeatedly to do so. Additional changes included two new potential files for the weapon, those being the poison file, which can inflict the poison ailment, and exhaust files, which allow the hunter to drain stamina from the monster and potentially stun them. 3 Ultimate took some notes from Portable Third and made the Switch Axe available from the get-go. The hunter no longer had to advance through this storyline in order to unlock it and would have a beginner bone axe available in their equipment box right away. Other than bringing over most of the weapon branches introduced in Portable Third, there weren't many changes this iteration, and there wouldn't be further mechanical changes until Generation 4. Let's take a look now. Monster Hunter 4 and 4 Ultimate added a few new additions to the Switch Axe, but nothing incredibly major. Of course, there's aerial attacks, and even an aerial reload if the hunter is below 40% on their gauge. Both sword and axe mode also have their own jumping attacks of varying effectiveness. A new double slash move is introduced that can launch the hunter forward slightly, and this move can be comboed into a quick elemental thrust to elemental discharge finisher. Remember the hack and slash move that drains stamina? It now has a high damage finisher introduced to it, which propels the hunter forward and can be sidestepped out of, really upping the usefulness of the combo and mobility of the hunter overall. Moving on to generations, we get to see the large inclusion of mechanics through hunter arts and styles. Just like previous videos, I won't go into every style and art, but we'll take a surface level look at the ones that were used in majority or the most effective. Like one can expect with various styles, multiple moves may be shifted around or locked out completely depending on which one you are currently using. In terms of effectiveness, aerial style is actually pretty decent. While using aerial style in sword mode, the kickoff launcher actually becomes an attack of its own, which contributes to 2 different hits with an upward and downward swing respectively. This is especially useful for dealing mounting damage thanks to the 2 hits and makes it a widely popular option for hunters. Elemental Discharge also starts off with an aerial combo that is stronger than your typical variation of the move. In Generations Ultimate, Alchemy style is possibly the most effective on the Switch Axe in comparison to any other weapons, considering it changes the attacks in a very unique way. Now all attacks on the X button will be axe attacks and automatically morph into axe mode while comboing. Similarly, all A attacks will be sword attacks and morph accordingly, and that's honestly just a really cool mechanic to introduce. Valor style has multiple moves that can be cancelled out of the Valor sheath, including morph moves from each form and both an X and A move for both the axe and sword respectively. For example, while in sword mode, cancelling out of the sheath with X will perform a strong upper swing. Once in Valor mode, hunters get access to an infinite morph attack combo that they can use by simply spamming R after an attack. On top of that, the sword gauge will begin to recharge faster, and they can perform a special elemental discharge finisher where the initial charge is faster and the burst activates twice for incredibly high damage. Many of the arts are fairly useful with the weapon as well. For example, Demon Riot will allow the sword gauge to drain over time, but in exchange, all sword attacks become stronger, and Tempest Axe, introduced in Generations Ultimate specifically, creates an overtime effect that makes multiple attack animations faster, and introduces a vertical slash attack similar to the finisher seen in the hack and slash combo. The chopping hack and slash ability specifically becomes incredibly fast and costs half the normal amount of stamina. Energy Charge was another hunting art that instantly charges the sword gauge. The art itself charges pretty fast, but the rate in which it charges was nerfed slightly in Generations Ultimate. However, due to how effective it is, it's possible for hunters to rarely if ever revert to axe mode if they prefer not to. Honestly, from the point of try up until 4U, the Switch Axe pretty much started with it all. There weren't many major changes that needed to be made to the weapon due to the overall amount of options and utility it had at its disposal. Generations Ultimate really blew the door wide open once again with the inclusion of styles and arts, bringing the functionality of the Switch Axe to an all-time high. Now, let's move on to Generation 5 and see what World brought to the table. I hope you're amped for Generation 5. This is such a dumb joke. Because the amped state of the Switch Axe was first introduced in this generation. World adds a new mechanic where attacking with the Switch Axe in sword mode will fill up a glowing meter effect around your sword gauge. Once full, the hunter will enter the amped state and gain additional damage as well as a new mechanic related to the weapon's file. As the hunter attacks in this state, the file will begin to apply an extra coat, dealing extra file specific damage to the monster. Discharge attacks also change within this state. Hunters can still perform their forward thrust attack into discharge, but if the forward thrust connects with the monster, the hunter will cling to whichever part they made contact with. Following this, hunters will perform a high damage discharge attack on the part that they are clinging onto before jumping off. This state is incredibly useful and great for maximizing damage, while giving the Switch Axe a little more meter management in comparison to its previous iterations. The state will revert over time, allowing hunters to build it up once again, meaning hunters are heavily rewarded for consistently attacking in sword mode. Speaking of meter management, morphing from one to the next also replenishes the gauge slightly, making it much easier to keep active. Morphing attacks are now easier to perform than ever and can be chained from almost every move in the weapon's arsenal, and the axe form actually gains its own fade slash ability. What's with every weapon stealing longsword mechanics? Something mentioned to me in the comments of previous videos is that I don't often talk about sliding attacks that are unique to this generation of the series. Sliding and pressing triangle will perform a basic axe form aerial attack, but jumping and pressing R2 will perform the upward and downward sword form slash similar to what we saw from aerial style in Monster Hunter Generations. This is the most effective attack generally, as it performs 2 attacks and leaves you in sword form, and you can immediately enter elemental discharge while performing it. And normal aerial attacks from jumping off a cliff remain mostly unchanged. Moving on to Iceborne, the big differences lie in each form. Axe form has been reworked slightly in how some of the combos work. Since I'm playing on Iceborne, I can't really show the differences, but the main combo has been reverted to what we've seen in previous generations. Additionally, the hack and slash or wild swing combo can now perform the overhead heavy slam finisher, which will power up axe form for a short period afterward, allowing it to, I think, do more damage and flinch monsters easier. Also, performing a slinger burst to cancel out of the wild swing will send the hunter flying backward for a good evasive opportunity. If you're wondering why I didn't show the fade slash animation when talking about it, that's because it was replaced completely in Iceborne. Instead of simply slashing away, the hunter will now evade backwards with an upward slash. The animation is much faster than the move in base world. Also, if everybody's getting fade slashes, I am now starting a petition to improve the fade slash for the longsword and Rise. Another part of the petition says that they need to send me a free copy, so be sure to sign. Thanks, Capcom. On to sword form, it should be mentioned that the clutch claw mechanic introduced to all weapons works as an axe form specific attack for the Switch Axe. However, the elemental discharge ability can now be comboed into a clutch claw attack. Now this functionality of this move is weird. Like I said, it basically cancels your elemental discharge into a clutch claw grapple, which is fine, but if you enter the amped state while grappling, you'll perform the elemental discharge as soon as you cling to the monster. I don't know, I feel like I'm missing something about this mechanic, as it seems really weird. Finally, we can move on to Rise, and as always I can point out that 1, this is the demo and not the full game, and 2, we are only going to be given 2 out of many potential Silkbind attacks, so what I mention here won't be everything the weapon has available to it. Anyway, there's nothing particularly crazy that's been changed in Rise in comparison to Iceborne. Once again, if you're familiar with the previous entry, you'll probably feel right at home with this one. What Rise does contribute is more of an incentive to utilize Axe form rather than just seeing it as a means of entering Sword form. Take the charged up effect that would be bestowed on the weapon after performing the overhead slam from Wild Swing. The move is now called Max Potency, and while I'm unsure if the effects from Iceborne are the same, one new effect to it is that it can speed up charging the amped state gauge while in Sword form. Hunters can now enter maximum potency in Axe form, switch to Sword form, and have a much easier time building up the amped state. Potentially the biggest addition aside from the Silkbind attacks is that the amp state now applies file effects to not only the Sword form, but the Axe form as well, and that's pretty cool. If for some reason you find yourself running out of Sword gauge and you switch back to Axe, the effects of your files will still apply, making reverting to Axe form much less of a chore and much more effective overall. Now, the first Silkbind attack, Invincible Gambit, seemed pretty useless to me. But who knows, maybe it can be better utilized by people that main the weapon. It launches the hunter forward in a combo that seems to have an effect similar to the Rocksteady Mantle, where you can't be knocked back but will still take damage, so it could be potentially useful as an evasive option, or if you absolutely must power through towards a monster. Hunters can also combo out of it, leading to high damage, but it didn't feel right to me. Switch Charger, the second Silkbind attack, seems a bit more useful. On top of launching you forward slightly, it also recharges your gauge by a fixed amount and prevents it from depleting for a finite period of time. This is particularly useful for when you want to stay in sword mode for as long as possible and get as much damage dealt as possible. Other than that, there don't seem to be any particularly huge changes to the weapon. I'll be curious to learn more about max potency upon the game's release, but for now, that's all I have for Monster Hunter Rise. For a weapon that was first released in Generation 3, there was a surprising amount of content about it to cover. I think that's because the weapon packed so much functionality and utility within it straight from the get-go, and then added small improvements through each game release and each generation. Comparing one release to the next, you may not see a large amount of changes to the weapon, but from the start of Generation 3 to where we are now in Rise, the Switch Axe has built up a surprising amount of depth. From a weapon that seemed complicated to use at first glance, but was actually fairly simple to utilize, to a destructive force that takes a bit longer to master, but is much more interesting to play in my opinion. Anyway, that's all I have for you today in regards to the Switch Axe. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Let me know what your favorite weapon is and what weapon you want me to cover next. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.